So in our third panel discussion, we will be hearing from 3 scholars who explore contested notions of equality. And the first one that we will hear from, Amanda Cobb-Greetham, will talk about LaDonna Harris, or Mama LaDonna, as some people came to know her, in this extraordinary discussion of a woman who is Comanche, who has been on the cutting edge of national and Oklahoma policy changes as it affects Indigenous rights. And so when we think about contested notions of equality, the issue of equality for Native women, for Indigenous women in Oklahoma, has never been quite the same as the struggle of, say, African Americans to be accepted into mainstream society. Mm-hmm. For Indigenous women, it is about sovereignty, self-government, protection of culture, the right to exist in the way that they choose, not simply to just be accepted into the mainstream. And so Amanda's discussion of LaDonna, I think, is very revealing of the power that she brings to Indigenous activism and how much change she's been able to affect. Not just in Oklahoma, she's certainly important there, but through her work, starting with Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity and her work with Americans for Indian Opportunity, I think it's hard to find an Indigenous rights activist who is more important than LaDonna Harris, and I think you'll see that in Amanda's discussion. We also have a really interesting discussion of the Equal Rights Amendment fight in Oklahoma. Chelsea Ball has done an extraordinary job of looking at Wanda Jo Stapleton, and this woman who isn't what you would think of as a feminist at first, or not what you would think of when many Oklahomans think, well, who is a woman who supports the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s? Well, Wanda Jo Stapleton was married to a Baptist minister, as Chelsea talks about. She was a housewife. But when she finds herself on her own, she realizes all of these ways that women who've been homemakers, who are conservative socially and in some cases religiously, find themselves unprotected in society. And so she gets involved in trying to affect change, and she's not entirely successful. Oklahoma chooses not to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, but it's really about exploring these contested notions of how one achieves equality. And our third discussion on the panel will be from Patty Loughlin, who will talk about Governor Mary Fallin, who many people, including Governor Fallin perhaps, wouldn't think of herself as an activist, but she absolutely is in the way that our panelists talk about the term. Mary Fallin is someone who looked around her and said, I don't like the way things are entirely, and I want to change them. And so she became active in politics, never lost an election, as Patty will talk about, and used her experience as a conservative, a mother, an Oklahoman, a businesswoman, to become engaged and try and affect change. And in the case of Governor Fallin, it was through holding elected office that she was most successful at affecting change. For some of the women that we have seen in earlier panels, it was a less direct way of trying to affect change. But I think in this final panel discussion, you see a lot of ways in which women don't fall into this monolithic format, right, where they find lots of different ways to affect change. They don't all have the same political affiliation or beliefs on any issue. It's really about ultimately celebrating women's contribution to society in Oklahoma as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we invite your questions and discussion during these sessions, and thank you for joining us for This Land is Her Land.
Hi, and I am here to talk to you about why women's activism in Oklahoma matters to high school students. I am the daughter of 2 history professors, so I've had my fair share of exposure to all sorts of historical facts and ideas. But not everyone has that opportunity, of course. And so what I've realized throughout my education in Oklahoma is that women's activism in Oklahoma is not a very widely talked about topic. And what I mean by that is that if we look through our textbooks in Oklahoma history and all sorts of history I have I've gone through in my years of schooling, not many of these women are not talked about that are talked about in Herland. And so what I mean by that is Ada Elizabeth Beale Fisher is not a huge topic in Oklahoma history currently right now. She was not someone we heard about a lot, nor many of these women in terms of LGBTQ activism, in terms of ERA activism. And so I think it's important that we try to shine a light on these women because, to be honest, many high school students could care less about history. They could care less about any event. They could care less. It all happened in the past. Who cares? But something I have noticed is that people my age tend to care more about activism and bringing about radical change. And so I think it is especially important for girls my age and even guys my age to learn about what women in Oklahoma did, not just women nationally, but women in Oklahoma in terms of the efforts that they made to bring about change in all sorts of different ways. And I think it is important for all of us to learn more about that because it gives people kind of hope and see, okay, look, we've come a long way, but there's still, of course, a way to go. And so I think that it is very important for especially young people to see that and to see in their home state women who are similar to them in a way, to see them coming from nothing and rising up and making a huge contribution to Oklahoma. And that is why I think that women's activism in Oklahoma is crucial to the education of all high school students, not just in Oklahoma. Thank you.
Amanda Cobb-Greetham serves as the professor and chair of the Department of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. From 2007 to 2012, she served with the Chickasaw Nation as the administrator for the Division of History and Culture, where she was instrumental in launching the Chickasaw Cultural Center in Sulphur, as well as the Chickasaw Press. Cobb-Greetham won the American Book Award for listening to our grandmother's stories, the Bloomfield Academy for Chickasaw Females, 1852 to 1949. She is the co-editor with Amy Lonetree, the National Museum for the American Indian, Critical Conversations. She served on the board of trustees of the Smithsonian National Museum for the American Indian. Chelsea Ball is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oklahoma. She specializes in post-war gender and politics with an emphasis on Oklahoma and the West. She graduated with her MA from the University of Oklahoma in 2016 and earned her BA in history education from the University of Central Oklahoma in 2014. Her forthcoming dissertation is tentatively titled West of Feminism, Gender, Religion, and the Politics of Equal Rights Amendment. Patty Loughlin is the professor of history at the University of Central Oklahoma. She specializes in the history of the American West, American Indian history, and women's and gender history. Patty serves on the Oklahoma Historical Society Board of Directors, the editorial boards for the Western Historical Quarterly and the Chronicles of Oklahoma, and remains active in the Coalition for Western Women's History and the Western History Association. Her book, Hidden Treasures of the American West, Muriel H. Wright, Angie Debo, and Alice Marriott, received the Outstanding Book on Oklahoma History from the Oklahoma Historical Society and the Director's Award and finalist in nonfiction from the Oklahoma Center for the book in 2006. She co-authored Building Traditions, Educating Generations, A History of the University of Central Oklahoma with Bob Burke, and co-edited Main Street, Oklahoma, An American Story with Linda Reese. Her latest book, Angie Debo, Daughter of the Prairie, received the 2018 Oklahoma Book Award for Children and Young Adult. She is currently co-editing This Land is Herland, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870 to 2010, with Sarah Epler Janda. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for This Land is Herland as we explore gendered activism in Oklahoma.
Chokma, Sahostrafawat, Amanda Cobb-Greetham, Chickasaw. My name is Amanda Cobb-Greetham, and I'm a Chickasaw citizen, born and raised in southern Oklahoma. I currently serve as a professor of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and as well as the director of OU's Native Nations Center. And I would just like to thank everyone involved for inviting me to be part of this project. I am thrilled and honored to have the chance to share my perspectives on the work of LaDonna Harris, Comanche leader, Comanche matriarch, and activist, and a woman who is much beloved throughout Indian country, and whose work has had a significant impact on the lives of so many, including myself. I've had the opportunity to work with LaDonna Harris over the past 20 years and to interview her many times. And so what I'm going to do today is read from a paper that I have written about LaDonna Harris and her work as a matriarch that also draws on interviews that I have had with her. So let's begin. LaDonna Harris first gained national attention as the wife of Fred Harris, who served as a state and then U.S. Senator from Oklahoma during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And as a team, LaDonna and Fred Harris's strong support of Indian issues in Congress made national headlines during the civil rights era. But her activism did not end with that era or with her marriage to Fred Harris. LaDonna's work and institution building, such as her creation of Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, the first intertribal advocacy organization in Oklahoma, shaped federal policy in ways that supported stronger tribal self-determination. And she built a legacy that continues to this day, largely through her national advocacy organization, Americans for Indian Opportunity. Harris is known for her tremendous personal warmth, her graciousness and powerful charisma, and it is undisputed that Harris is a leader. But I would like to consider that today. Why is her leadership effective? How is her leadership effective? She's not like other leaders as we understand the term. Leadership, as we currently understand it, tends to privilege one person in a hierarchical position of power, and then we honor that person for their accomplishments as an individual. And frequently, when a woman is given attention as a leader, either within a system or in active opposition to a system, it is because she is a woman, that is the first woman in a position that's customarily been held by men. But LaDonna Harris is different. She's never held an elected or appointed office in either tribal, federal, or state government. She has never led a protest or political movement. Instead, she began by using her position as the wife of a U.S. Senator and the proximal power it vested in her as a platform from which to restructure and give shape to American Indian policy from inside the system. She cultivated key relationships during this period from which she built broader networks to influence policymakers' decisions. Okay, so what are her greatest accomplishments? Well, when Harris arrived in Washington, D.C., the federal government generally treated tribes as archaic, programmatic units whose problems were handled by a paternalistic Bureau of Indian Affairs, an agency who often as not saw the tribe itself as the problem. Treating tribes as sovereign governments was not imagined as an option. You see, this was the termination era, an era of federal policy toward tribes, during which government officials focused on termination, that is, cutting off any kind of federal tribal relationship altogether. And this is the context into which the Harrises entered. As Harris herself said, quote, "Most of the federal Indian policy was designed to make us go away." That federal policy ever dictated this level of oppression and cruelty is unconscionable, but it did. And Harris felt the trauma wrought by these policies in her physical person, describing at various points in her life how, quote, "the pain comes back like post-traumatic stress syndrome, makes me feel like I have to throw up, like food turned sour." And Harris went on to describe this pain as the catalyst for her work. And she said, quote, "These are the things I worked all my life to rid other people of so that they wouldn't hurt." You see, LaDonna Harris saw quite clearly that the New World wasn't new and that the frontier wasn't empty and that the closing of the frontier, which ironically for Harris was marked by the opening of Indian Territory and the establishment of Oklahoma as the 46th state, did not end the devastation wrought by physical conquest. Harris herself said, quote, "We Indians are past the colonialism physically, but we are not out of it politically." In the context of American settler colonialism, settlers first imposed power through the dispossession of land, declared the acquired territory a new homeland, and then tried to eliminate and erase Native peoples through every kind of policy, from treaty making, forced removal, warfare, land allotment, and ultimately the sweeping assimilation policies expressly designed to erase Native languages, cultures, religions, histories, and value systems. These were the policies in place during Harris's formative years growing up. As she explained herself, quote, "In the 1950s, we Indians were supposedly fading away so rapidly that there wouldn't be Indians around much longer, and this whole assimilation process was designed to help it along." Harris's articulation of government officials' conviction that Native people would eventually reach the end of the trail and disappear into the mythic past underscores her understanding that according to these policies, Native Americans are not supposed to have a future. Colonial policies resulted not only in the dispossession of Indigenous land and the erasure of Indigenous histories, but also in the foreclosure of a distinctly Indigenous future. For Harris, the pain of that realization is palpable. She acknowledges that healing from trauma is an ongoing process, and as she put it, "To live in this world, I have to take a deep breath." Sometimes taking a deep breath and remembering the past, but choosing the future, is a specifically conscious choice. And that federal Indian policy shifted so radically throughout the 1970s and beyond represents profound changes engendered by LaDonna Harris and her colleagues. You see, her effectiveness as a leader, as I understand it, is based on her unwillingness to give up her Comanche values and her worldview. She won't give up herself. She never has. So as a Comanche woman from Oklahoma, rooted in her values, Harris has always known who she is and has understood exactly where she was. And she was in a position to make history by ensuring a Native American future. So how did she go about accomplishing this objective? Well, she was married to a U.S. senator, and as such, she occupied a unique position. As an Indian person, she was considered by law to be a ward of the federal government. As a woman from Oklahoma, she was perceived to be a poor country girl. As the wife of Fred Harris, she was considered by virtue of marriage to a sitting U.S. senator to be part of the power structure, the very same power structure that was trying to erase Native people. Significantly, she embraced all aspects of her identity. She remarked that, quote, "My being an Indian, born to a poor family and the wife of a candidate for president, is as much a part of me as being a woman." And as she says, "I filter everything through Comanche values." She was born on a Comanche allotment in southern Oklahoma, formerly Indian Territory, in 1931, just 24 short years after Oklahoma statehood. Harris was raised primarily by her grandparents, Wakia and John Tabutite, and she cites them as the source of her values. They were born, respectively, in 1883 and 1872. Her grandparents lived through the period in American history that was characterized by the Dawes Allotment Act and the Indian Wars, and these policies resulted in the fracturing of tribal governments, the containment of decimated families on reservations, and the separation of these families from their children through federal Indian boarding schools based on assimilative policies. So you see, for LaDonna Harris, the conquest of the West was not part of some sort of mythologized national past. This was part of her dinner time conversation, part and parcel of the context in which she grew up. I point out to my students that while 100 years ago may seem like a long time, 100 years ago can be the length of just one person's life. And when you view history through the lens of lifetimes, 100 years ago is nothing. It really collapses time in such a way that we understand just how much policies enacted during a given lifetime, like reservation or warfare or allotment, impact people to this day. Harris understood her own identity in relationship to the identity of her grandparents, and she was fully immersed in Comanche culture, and she understood herself first and foremost as a Comanche person. And as she says herself, her life and her work cannot be understood separately from her Comanche values, because being Comanche for Harris is not something you are, it's something you live. So let's think about her work in that context. Through her experiences as a senator's wife and Indian advocate, LaDonna Harris began to come to a fuller understanding of how she could best make a contribution. And she firmly resisted the erasure of all things Indian and refused to go away. She intentionally embraced her identity, and she asked other Native Americans to embrace theirs too. And she expanded her own circle of kinship by creating two organizations. First, Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, and then later in the 1970s, Americans for Indian Opportunity. The creation of OIO and then later AIO forced government officials to see the continued existence of Native people not as people of the past, but as people of the present and future, and to acknowledge the persistence of Native entities as persistent, culturally distinctive entities. And LaDonna Harris concentrated through the programs of these organizations on Native youth. And so she set up a system where she could make the greatest contribution of all from her particular and personal power as a matriarch. She shared her own gift with youth, and therefore she shared her own core cultural values with upcoming generations of Native people. So she created these youth programs in ways that honored matriarchal knowledge. And I use this term matriarchal specifically because I'm also going to use a term that many are unfamiliar with, rematriation. Why rematriation? We're more familiar with repatriation. Repatriation is common parlance in Indian country, particularly because we use it as part of the Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. And this act provided for the repatriation of human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects of cultural patrimony that have been held by museums, and as a result of this act, were then restored to our people and our tribes. So repatriation itself highlights a notion of ownership and property. These things belonged to museums and then were restored to us. When I use the term rematriation as opposed to repatriation, I am drawing attention to Harris's understanding that colonial policies were not just designed to dispossess Native people of the land. They were also designed to dispossess Native people of their cultures, of cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledge is not the property of a person that as a tangible belonging can be bought, sold, or destroyed. Harris's work rejects that notion. Her conceptualization of cultural knowledge also highlights belonging, but situates it instead of an active part of her kinship, making cultural knowledge not about ownership, but about relationships. And relationships in this sense are not about an object's belonging to a person, but to a person's belonging to a people, culture, and community. Harris's efforts to restore core cultural values then, I describe using a different term because I don't believe repatriation fits. I use the term rematriation in the spirit of the matriarchal nature of LaDonna Harris herself. So what did she do? She developed two organizations, Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity and Americans for Indian Opportunity, both of which were advocacy organizations, nonprofits that worked on a variety of issues. I argue that her greatest legacy came from the youth initiatives of both of these programs. The first, let's talk a little bit about OIO. OIO grew out of a set of community organizing experiences that began at the University of Oklahoma's Southwest Center for Human Relations. And her husband was invited to attend, and he could not go, so LaDonna Harris went in his place. And as she shared the story, it's clear she became viscerally upset with the conversation, because in the minds of the learned colleagues, professors around the table, Native Americans weren't included in this conversation on civil rights and race. And as she told me, she shared that she couldn't find a way to articulate herself, and she ultimately burst into tears. This definitely changed the conversation. She said they couldn't see they were a part of the problem, and I so wanted them to understand. Although embarrassed by her behavior, it changed the course of the conversation. And she said, out of that nucleus, we started Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity. And as Harris remembered, the organization began in true LaDonna Harris style in her living room. So Harris and her new cohort recognized Johnson's war on poverty and vision of a great society as a way to spotlight Native issues that were related to poverty and discrimination. And so the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO, became the means through which she did this. And through this program, then she developed, in fact, a youth program, along with her colleagues, Iola Hayden and others in Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity. You see, Harris herself refused to assimilate. She refused to deny who she was, and she didn't understand why anyone should have to do that. So she was telling me a story about an early OIO project that was examining the high rate of high school dropout among Native kids. And she visited with Native children in a school, and they shared with her that they felt humiliated almost every day by teachers who called them squaws and used all these horrible terms. And LaDonna Harris said, quote, "These kids felt something was wrong with them, that the system, they learned that Indian culture had no value, and that because they were part of that culture, they had no value." The answer to this problem for LaDonna Harris was to, quote, "take away their pain by restoring pride in their cultural heritage and making sure that they felt their cultures and values in the same ways that she had always found strength in." So this was the beginning of a program that seemed very radical at the time, as all policies were designed to strip Native culture away from students, not to restore it, enhance it, to deepen it. And that's what she did. And I find that an act of rematriation. She acted as a matriarch in the same way her grandmother and great-grandmother raised her. This was her first youth leadership program. She later, in 1970, founded Americans for Indian Opportunity, a similar organization in many ways to OIO, but AIO was on a national stage. And over time, again, AIO was an advocacy program, intertribal, and focused on a variety of policy issues. However, over the years, AIO developed a youth leadership program based this time not on high school students, but this time based on young Native professionals who had just begun their careers, individuals between the ages of 25 and 35, and LaDonna Harris saw an opportunity not just to share and help restore core cultural values, but to make sure that these individuals, called ambassadors, would go forward in their daily lives restoring these core cultural values in everything they did, not in two worlds, this world and that world, but in every step that each individual takes on the earth. So her desire for these young leaders is to participate fully in the world in any way and in any place without giving up cultural identities or sense of indigeneity. So if her initial goal in OIO was to rematriate core cultural values and share them with Native youth, her vision as implemented through AIO is for the ambassadors, who are trained and encouraged to express those core cultural values, to contribute to the restoration of Indigenous cultural values at every level. And now almost 30 years have passed since AIO welcomed its first class of ambassadors into the AIO family. I will share with you that I myself have served as an ambassador in this organization and can speak as a firsthand witness of just how powerful this initiative can be. And a look at the work of Ambassador alumni illustrates the far-reaching scope of Harris's vision and the extent to which Ambassador alumni have honored the gift that she has shared, the gift of rematriation. Alumni have gone on to serve as elected and appointed tribal government officials, federal government officials, lawyers, practicing artists, musicians, filmmakers, radio hosts, TV producers, directors of museums, cultural centers, academics, language revitalizers, professors, CEOs and nonprofit directors, and board members for virtually every organization in the United States Indian country. And most significantly, the large majority of Ambassador alumni continue to work directly on behalf of Native nations, shaping the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the federal governments through their active participation in it from wherever they are situated. Harris's rematriative process restores cultural values to a person, and if they were not in need of restoration, deepens them, enhances them, enables that person to manifest them in such a way so that they are always at home, no matter where they live, no matter where I live, to be at home with yourself and in your sureness and confidence in your own core cultural values and to carry those forward. As she does so, she is fulfilling her own kinship obligations, and she is expressing a version of leadership which, though not popularly understood in our society, is nevertheless critically significant and important. She has devoted herself to undoing and healing the pain of internalized oppression that she herself felt safeguarded cultural heritage and ensured cultural continuance. Harris remarked when I interviewed her on just how surprised the architects of assimilation must have been to find out 50 years later that Native people didn't disappear. Quote, "Little did they know we are growing bigger and better." So yes, that Harris is a leader is undisputed, but she is more than a leader. She's a matriarch. And it is this identity that best explains her legacy and her modality. Her status as a matriarch extends well beyond the Comanche Nation. She's cherished throughout Indian country and treated much the same way her own family treated her great-grandmother. And used a matriarchal lens to analyze her vision and goals for her youth leadership programs in order to make clear the remarkable nature of her legacy. The rematriation of core cultural values, the recreation and forging of kinship relationships and obligations make sure that Native people aren't part of the past, but part of the present and part of the future, a distinctly Native future. Chokmashki Yakoke, thank you very much for this opportunity.
I first want to say thank you to Patty and Sarah for inviting me to be a part of this really great edited volume. I'm excited about the work that we've been doing and to share with you the story of Wanda Jo Peltier, who is now Wanda Jo Stapleton. She was instrumental in the Equal Rights Amendment debate and fight here in Oklahoma, very important to women here and across the country. Before I jump into the details about Wanda Jo's really cool life and the impact that she had here, I want to sort of give some historical context about the ERA, as well as how feminism and the ERA are related, to sort of give you an idea of how Wanda Jo's story intersects there. So the Equal Rights Amendment was written and presented by the National Women's Party as a sort of next step after women won the right to vote in 1920. Basically, once the vote was won, this idea that there's all these next steps that needed to be taken and all these layers of discrimination that women still faced at the local and the state and the national level that needed to be tackled and undone. A constitutional amendment seemed like the most straightforward and easy way to do that. So it has this very long history in connection with suffrage. These levels of inequality that the ERA was set to address unfortunately go largely unchecked. So the inequalities that women see in the 1920s are largely the same in 1972 when the ERA is finally approved by Congress. So for 50 years, this amendment was presented to women, or by women, to Congress, and every year denied, up until 1972. And Wanda Jo's life and the experiences that she has really sort of epitomize a lot of these inequalities that multiple women face across the country and here in Oklahoma. She grows up in relative poverty. She faces the life of a widow. She becomes a displaced homemaker, meaning she was a housewife, and her husband passed away suddenly, and she found herself with 2 children to take care of and no real job prospects or experience because she had been in the home. She tackles all of those issues, right? She also has to face being denied equal pay when she does go and get her education and gets a job at OBU. She experiences tenure denial because of her gender, and she also faces a lot of inequality when it comes to raising her children alone as well. So these sort of experiences that she has with inequality really color her activism, which is really similar to what we see with LaDonna Harris and even with our other highlight, Mary Fallin, right? Their lived experiences really highlight the type of activism that they get involved in. So Wanda Jo, because of these experiences and because she sort of has to become a fighter through all this inequality based on her gender, is sort of naturally gets involved in the feminist movement here in Oklahoma. And the feminist movement here in Oklahoma, small but growing through the sort of second wave feminism that the country is experiencing, really, for the most part, works really well with the Equal Rights Amendment debates that are up. So as this debate, the state-by-state ratification debate is going on in the 70s and into the early 80s, this connection between the ERA and feminism is very strong, and the debate over feminism itself becomes a real highlight of this movement. As the women's movement is growing, there's also a growing conservative movement of Christian right organizations that is growing as well. And what makes these organizations really powerful and really unique is women themselves. So we have conservative women joining these groups, which, like I said, is extremely powerful. And they sort of position themselves as what they call the alternative to women's liberation, or to women's livers, as they would call them. And so they see the ERA and feminism as intertwined and as one. And they sort of make this argument that feminists are out of touch with America's women, that they are trying to undermine the sort of family system, right? They're not interested in having children, but most of all, they are undermining these religious-based gender roles between men and women. So this idea that the man is sort of the patriarch of the family, and the woman is sort of subservient in that role. So Wanda Joe's life kind of undermines this argument, and she uses her life experiences and her identities to really push back against these arguments, and uses these ideas to ratify or push to ratify the ERA. So she sort of says, look, I'm a mother. She's very religious. She was a Baptist preacher's wife for a very long time until her husband passed away. She was a housewife at one point. But she's sort of like, I'm also a feminist. So she's really sort of undermining their argument by challenging them through her own identity. And she does this in a lot of humorous ways. One of my favorite memories of her interviewing her, and I have a great photo of, is a bake-off that she did at the Capitol. So one of the ways that women against the ERA or anti-ERA women would lobby or campaign against the amendment was to bake bread and pies for legislators in the Oklahoma State Capitol as a way to kind of, in a roundabout way, bribe them. So this is also a way to sort of express their sort of dominance over femininity, that sort of they're this representation of housewives and women. So to push back against this idea that feminists couldn't be housewives or that women for the ERA couldn't bake, I guess, she decided that she was going to create an ERA bake-off and challenge an anti-ERA woman to a pie baking contest, of which none of the women took her up on, so she did a bake-off against a man, which is pretty funny, and she won a ERA apron. And women would do other forms of pushback and activism like this. They would do fashion shows, guerrilla theater, all of these different ways to both push back against this idea of who they were and also to reassert their femininity. And for Wanda Joe, it was really important to be a supporter for housewives themselves. So I think this really hurt her in a lot of ways, that she was seen as someone against housewives. So she actually wrote curriculum that helped displaced homemakers. It trained women on how to write resumes, how to apply for jobs, how to negotiate for a pay raise, and this curriculum was so important that it was actually adopted on a national level to help women like this all around the country. So I sort of make this argument that Wanda Joe is sort of the epitome of something I call Oklahoma feminism. So it's the sort of third way almost, where these women don't fit into necessarily this East Coast type of feminism, but they also have a lot in common with conservative women outside of the ERA. So women like Wanda Joe can sort of say, I go to church and I love being a mother, and I'm also extremely pro-choice, and I'm for the ERA. And this identity, this sort of being able to be both, is something that I think a lot of women in Oklahoma and in the greater West begin to identify with, as this being able to exist in both of these spaces. And I think that's something that's really powerful.
So thank you to Jake Krumwiede, director of the Cherokee Strip Regional Heritage Center, and Kathy Dixon and Elizabeth Bass of the Oklahoma Historical Society, as well as support from Oklahoma Humanities, for this opportunity to discuss women's political activism in Oklahoma as it connects to OK Women 100, a century of women's suffrage, and a discussion of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 1920, extending voting rights to women. And so it's been such a wonderful journey for me to collaborate with my colleague Sarah Janda in several writing projects, and one of them that's come together over the past couple of years is This Land is Herland. And so excited to bring together 13 scholars featuring 13 women as they relate to political activism in Oklahoma. And so when I think about my work and what I bring to this project, it makes me think about Mary Fallin, as well as Alice Mary Robertson, who is featured in the book in an earlier section. Alice Mary Robertson became the first woman from Oklahoma elected to U.S. Congress in 1920. And the second woman elected to Congress from Oklahoma would be Mary Fallin, 86 years later in 2006. So I've been thinking about this lately, and I'm thinking about this very long pause, 86 years. And so I'm thrilled that we're all coming together to talk about political activism in Oklahoma as it relates to women, as it relates to the vote, and hopefully we can help rectify that pause and see more women involved in a variety of different ways, including serving in political leadership. Alice Mary Robertson was an anti-suffragist from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And once Oklahoma extended the vote to women in 1918, she decided to run for office. And she served one term. And while in Congress, Mary Fallin drafted a resolution to honor Alice Mary Robertson as the second woman elected to Congress and the first woman ever to sit in the Speaker's chair in the U.S. House of Representatives. So it's very fitting to me as I reflect and think about Mary Fallin that she in turn honored Alice Mary Robertson for her earlier work and contributions and her service to Oklahoma. And yet when we think about this long pause, I also think about the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, no woman served in the Oklahoma legislature. It was not until the 1990s that women capture major statewide offices. So the 1990s. Women's suffrage was achieved in Oklahoma in November 1918, and the League of Women Voters formed. And we think about the legacies of this earlier work reflecting on 1920. Today, nearly 70 million women vote in the United States, and this is a legacy of the 19th Amendment, the legacy of women's suffrage in this country. But Mary Fallin and her political work and her activism is also the legacy of women's suffrage. When I think about the politics of Mary Fallin, she had a remarkable career in public service. And one fact remains with me: Mary Fallin has never lost an election. And you think, how can that be? How can it be that she's never lost an election? Remarkable. So from the State House to Lieutenant Governor to Congress to Governor of Oklahoma, she never lost an election. And her career in public service began in 1990 when she was elected to the Oklahoma House, and she served 2 terms. In 1995, voters elected Fallin as lieutenant governor, as Oklahoma's first woman and first Republican, and she served for 12 years. Then she served in Congress representing the 5th District of Oklahoma, beginning in 2006 and reelected in 2008. And later she served 2 terms as governor, beginning with her election in 2010. And so throughout all of this work, all of these political contributions, we also look at her political rhetoric and the notion of motherhood. Her role as a mother to her 2 children has remained front and center in her life, as well as her political rhetoric. As she has maintained in an oral history interview, "My children are more important to me than any office I may hold." I think if you can set your priorities and keep them, the balancing act becomes much easier. So I reflect on that. The rhetoric that she uses very effectively helps explain to us as we think about women's politics in Oklahoma, women's political contributions, and her conservative activism. It might help explain how she used motherhood as a political tool to be so effective in her political career and never lost an election. A Republican, she's intentionally and successfully using the politics of motherhood in every campaign. For example, throughout her political career, Mary Fallin frequently referred to giving birth between the primary and the general election to demonstrate her own toughness and commitment to politics. And she also used this strategy quite effectively against her male opponents, saying, you think you're tough and you want to know how tough I am, try giving birth between the primary and the general. That quickly silences the crowd, right? So who was she? Mary Fallin was raised a Democrat in Tecumseh and became a Republican after college. Both her father and her mother served as mayor of Tecumseh. And her story then is part of a larger movement of conservative women who became politically active in the late 1970s, 1980s, and saw the ways the government directly impacted their lives and saw a need to get involved themselves and affect true change, joining the ranks of the Republican Party and holding elected positions nationally and in Oklahoma. Her first campaign in 1990 was for the House of Representatives, Oklahoma House, and her campaign consisted of volunteers. She kept working full-time, managing hotels until June of that year and campaigned nights and weekends. And again, we are thinking about that image where she's talking about being 8 months visibly pregnant and using it quite effectively when she would recall later in oral interviews. She said, "It was interesting to see the reaction of voters as I rang their doorbells and presented them with my campaign brochure and my ever-expanding self as a candidate for the legislature. I was asked to step into many homes to rest my swollen feet and have much-needed refreshment." So this, as we look back on the early 1990s, this has everything to do with gender expectations, with motherhood, with politics and pregnancy. But what we see Mary Fallin doing is rather than masking it, not talking about it, she's using it so effectively as a political tool to defeat her opponents. She's navigating the gendered politics of women politicians and motherhood as she witnesses this shift in the state from Democrat to Republican around the same time. And then I turn to the historic campaign for governor of Oklahoma in 2010. 2 women running in this groundbreaking election year for women, 2010. Mary Fallin as the Republican candidate for governor, and Jerry Askins as the Democratic candidate. And both candidates had defeated men in the primary. Both candidates held relatively centrist views on almost all major issues, and so the electorate would really have to decide what distinguishes the two. And in this historic campaign with 2 women running, sometimes there were some negative campaign tactics or rhetoric that was used. And so frequently, when you look at the scholarship, you see quite a few scholars turning to this first televised debate between Jerry Askins and Mary Fallin. And in this televised debate, Jerry Askins calls Mary Fallin a show horse. And Jerry Askins refers to herself as a workhorse to distinguish the two. When Mary Fallin was asked what distinguished her as a candidate from her opponent, she said, "I think my experience is one of the things that sets me apart as a candidate for governor. First of all, being a mother, having children, raising a family." And she's doing this, and she's using this rhetoric, in a sense, to privilege her own role as a mother, and noted the absence of motherhood for Askins. So, show horse versus workhorse, motherhood versus the absence of motherhood. But again, as we see throughout her 3 decades of political life, Mary Fallin is using motherhood as a political asset. When asked to defend her comments regarding her opponent, Fallin responded that motherhood helped her relate to other Oklahomans. It made her relatable and it made her effective. And Mary Fallin won the election with over 60% of the vote. So again, within Fallin's rhetoric of motherhood and politics, we see glimpses of themes that have remained constant in her life and in her politics. Motherhood, campaigning during pregnancy as an example of her political toughness, and later as a single mom balancing work and family and her commitment to public service through these elected political positions. And so I'm so very thankful to all of the collaborators and to your participation, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion together.